This evening is Designing Reflective Assessments. I'm Kim McMonigal, Director of Director of Educational Technology for Douglas County School District, and I am excited to share some resources for how we can measure growth for effectively using technology to support learning. So we're thinking about different types of assessments that allow really authentic reflections and about the learning, and so we're going to look at some different ways to do that. The first thing I want to point out is that I do have an image here, and it's called the SAMR model, and it's one of the things we want to think about as we're using technology to support our learning. And you know, the use of technology often starts with just being able to substitute something we would have done with paper and pencil. So some of the things I might show you, we could look at it through this lens of, is it a substitution? Does it somehow augment the learning where the tech is going to act as a direct tool to substitute, but it improves the functionality? And I actually think a lot of the examples we're seeing in schools today are at this augmentation level. So I challenge all of us as we're thinking about the different resources and examples I share with you, how can we move them up to a higher level where we start to transform our learning? And it becomes, the use of tech allows for modification. The tech then allows us for significant task redesign. So something we would have done with, say, a worksheet or a workbook or a face-to-face learning, what's a slight tweak we can do that can also make it even more transformative learning for our students. And at the highest level, we're looking for technology to allow the creation of new tasks previously inconceivable, something you never would have thought of doing with your learners, but because of technology, we're now able to try things. So we're going to use this SAMR model throughout our discussion and see if we can think about how would we refresh even the examples I'm giving you. So one of the things we're doing throughout the district is we're aligning with our district strategic plan, and it says that we offer a world-class education for all learners. And something that's helping all of us is to create a backwards plan. So we're beginning this evening with making sure that our enduring understanding throughout all of our discussion tonight is about assessment and how reflections can be those critical understanding that enhances performance. So I'd love for Julie and Andrea to reflect in the side chat and give me some, when you see this as an understanding and you know this is where we're going, would you please reflect about what that could mean to you? What are you going to be looking for in the reflections that we talk about tonight? So what's going to make them seem to be higher order thinking or critical thinking? And how is it going to enhance our students' learning or performance? Lynn, welcome as well, and Allison, welcome. So all of you, I'm asking you to stop and reflect about our enduring understandings. I have some different examples listed here that I'm going to be using throughout the evening, but in order for this to be an enduring understanding, we really need to stop at the beginning of our learning and think about what it could mean at the beginning and then come back to it. I also will try to do an interim check about halfway through and see how well the resources I'm sharing are helping us to deepen our understanding about reflective practices in our to use as an assessment tool. So Andrea is connecting with Bloom's, and critical being that we're going to need to go to a higher level, right, Andrea? We're going to want to go beyond fact-based, low-level thinking, and we're going to want the types of reflections our students do to be higher order thinking. So that really requires us as the educators to design higher order thinking questions. Are we asking our students to analyze and evaluate? Are we asking them to create new solutions and to even create really deep open-ended questions? So that's exactly what we're thinking about. To be an enduring understanding, Julie is saying that most assessments she gives do not involve a lot of critical thinking. They're pretty low level as far as the rigor and relevance. So Julie, even that tells me you're aware of Daggett's work and that he also is encouraging us to find ways to bump up the level of the rigor, which would be to get to that higher order thinking. And I think, Julie, oftentimes our textbooks and the worksheets that we're using often are asking those lower level factual questions. And in fact, I think of often when I taught 4th grade or 6th grade that the enrichment questions were always the higher order and asked us to apply what we were understanding or to make evaluations. So I appreciate your, let's see, Allison, let's see, when students can transfer across content and apply the knowledge to solving new problems. So when you're talking about that transfer across content, that really gets us into some systems thinking. And again, that's another one of our world-class targets that we're looking for, is that the learning opportunities we provide and the assessments that we give our students provide our students those opportunities to make some real cross-content systemic thinking. And ultimately, we want that sustainable learning. And that's going to be that learning that really sticks because it's something that's authentic. And I love this idea of reflective practices. And we're going to look at it through the lens of e-portfolios. So just checking for understanding in the back channel, what's your experience with e-portfolios? Have you used them for PGI credit in the professional development? And so if you've used them personally, and then have you started to use them with students? Because that's the place I'm going to start, is with the e-portfolios for our learners. We're going to take a look at learning reflections using social learning networks. So social learning networks can be things like Edmodo, Moodle, Schoology, using them in blogs. I'm trying to think of other resources, the social learning. In Twitter, we have some teachers that are using Twitter as a place for students to reflect about, might be something they're reading or topics that they're discussing. Using them, social learning network, even in a back channel type of, like using Cover It Live or using Today's Meet. So experiences with this as well. So I'm looking for you to connect to these ideas before I begin. And so I'm kind of fleshing them out as I go through each of them. We're going to look at reflective assessments using Google Forms. And so what's your comfort level or experience with Google Forms? And a lot of times we use them as a survey tool, but this is that idea that we could make a modification and have new learning that maybe wouldn't be possible before we had the technology tools to let us be so collaborative. And the last one we're going to cover tonight is collaborative reflections that can impact perspectives. So in this case, I'm going to use Google Docs and share with you how if you put in an article that you want your students to work in a small team, I recommend usually the 3 to 5, 5 to 7 size. If you give it to your entire class, I found a lot of these collaborative tools become unwieldy. And just like we find in the classroom, having a conversation with 3 to 5 people gives us a lot of different perspectives, but it also allows us to have more of an authentic conversation. We're actually going to use some research from UW-Madison. There's a white paper on authenticity in instruction. And one of the ways we find that is through reflective responses. And whether you're doing it in a social learning network, whether you're doing it in your e-portfolio, having a learning space, whether you're doing it in a Google form or you're doing it collaboratively with your classmates, there's a lot of opportunities for going deeper in our learning. And to what Julie said, often the assessments that we find in our textbooks are just at that surface, low-level fact-finding, remembering, understanding content, but it's not asking our students to go deeper. So we're hoping that with all of these types of examples, that we're going to see a transformation of instruction using the tech to support the learning. So we hope that that's an outcome from this. So I appreciate all of you sharing. Lynn, I'm just going to do a little bit of the back channel connections, is having her 3rd graders through 6th graders using portfolios, e-portfolios to reflect on their learning. And I think some of us have been teaching long enough to remember, I think it was more in the 80s, maybe early 90s, when we heard that portfolios using file folders, and that we would send the folder from kindergarten through 6th grade. And for a while, it was a trend through the writing process, and that we would be able to see that evolution of a student's writing and thinking as we passed it. My experience with it has been that that type of paper portfolio, by the time it gets to 6th grade, there wasn't a lot they could do with some kindergarten, 1st, 2nd grade work. So, and just the management, you know, some of those binders, or they were using boxes to get to the portfolios. I think the idea was right about having our learners be reflective about who they are as a learner, setting goals, and then having evidence that shows their journey along the way, and then being able to think about how the pieces of evidence show their growth and in academics, as well as it could be their growth in responsibility, their growth as a social person. So they have all kinds of ways that the evidence could be showcased throughout their portfolio. All right, well, I think we're ready to get started. Thank you for thinking deeply about our enduring understanding. Our essential question for this evening is, why is it important to have a variety of formative and summative assessments to measure effective learning? And I think this really goes to what we're trying to create with a balanced assessment system in the district. And I'm going to go back to, I think it was Julie who mentioned about the assessments that we use in our classes can often be the more formative, what do you understand and how do I know what level of thinking you're at. I'm wondering what types of summative assessments you're using, and if you could give me some examples of what's happening in your classrooms. Julie's got something going on. Let's see, Andrea is using ePortfolios personally for her PGI, for her teacher evaluation through the EdTech Academy and with her students. And Andrea, I think that's an important piece that you mentioned. We're still fine-tuning and learning as a class. Really identifying the purpose for the ePortfolio is key to the success and the key to making them meaningful to the learner. So I have to say that I've watched the PGI or ePortfolios through the professional development change of focus, and here's where I'm seeing it. I was very excited by the ePortfolios, that as we were learning in our courses, we were being very reflective. Most of the PGI requirements require reflection as well as evidence of what you've learned and how you applied it. And then all of a sudden I had some people stop wanting to share, and they said it was because in their school, their administrator might have asked for them. There's that little section in the center of the ePortfolios for us as educators that have the site, this teacher evaluation, the 6 standards. And I think some of the administrators had asked, could you start to put evidence in that section? Well, as soon as that portfolio moved from being a safe learning space that was collaborative, that we were willing to share, and so we could learn from each other very transparently. Oh, I took this class, and this is what I learned, and this is some evidence of what I applied from my learning, to it becoming evaluative. I think then we've lost all the power in that whole piece of learning from each other. So I do caution that if there's pieces of a portfolio that are evaluative, that I recommend putting them in a Google Doc and only sharing the Google Doc. You can link it in your ePortfolio, but only share that with your administrator or whoever you would choose to share your evaluative pieces with. So Andrea, you might be hearing some of the same things or thinking about it, but I think that translates to our students as well, that we have to be very careful about the purpose. If it's a learning space, we aren't going to put all the evidence of who we are as we're being assessed. And one of our schools did have a space for that. They had their students sharing their TCAP results, their MAP testing, their grades, and looking for trends and then setting goals. The problem was then a student doesn't want to share their learning space if all their data is also on there. So we have a couple choices. My recommendation again is to use a Google Doc for any of the pieces that are evaluative, and those can be linked and only viewable by the teacher and the student or the parents. But then opening up the learning space for collaborative projects and evidence of what they're learning across their content. And back to let's see who said it. Allison, I think was, yeah, Allison, you made the comment about transferring across content. So how powerful is it in an e-portfolio to show a piece of evidence, a piece of your learning, reflect about it and show how it connects to math, to science, to social studies, to your literature. And I actually haven't seen many examples of that cross-content in our e-portfolio. So I'd be really interested if you have something to please share it. So I love this quote from one of our gurus in education, from Grant Wiggins, and he challenges us to say that authentic assessments require the learners to be the ones to perform or apply what they learn in real-world experiences or scenarios that replicate the real world. And moving beyond that, true, false, the low level, this goes to right along with what we've all been saying at the beginning of this webinar, moving from right, wrong, paper and pencil, where the learning requires collaboration, communication, and higher order thinking. So I think this last part right here is key to the use of technology and the tools that we're going to be looking at. So important to have a variety, because if all we use are the low level true false, we're only getting a snapshot of our students as what they remember and understand for that moment. We're not really going to see the learning over time and how sustainable it is. So let's look at an example of different measurements. How are we going to know that we are providing effective digital age teaching and learning? How are we going to measure that? And at the very beginning of the webinar, I used this SAMR model to give us a framework for it. So again, I'm reminding you, I'm about to show you 4 or 5 examples, and I'm going to ask you to evaluate it based on, and I'll put this in the side chat, are you seeing the level of the use of technology to be a substitution? And please don't think I feel like these are judgments. I actually think we all need to know the rubric well enough, or the standards well enough, that augmentation means that we substitute the paper and pencil, and there's some level of functionality improvement. Substitute, sorry, got to get my spelling in here. Substitute, tool, and improves function. So I'm going to put this in the back channel so that you have it as we're going along. You know what? I have something better. I actually have this doc. Let me link it, and that way you can have it on your screen as well, and it'll make it a little bit easier to refer to as we're talking. All right, so here is, let's see. And this also gives you the resource for the gentleman. It's Dr., and it's hard to say his name. Ruben is fine, but the Puentendoras, I'll let you try to pronounce it. I'm going to put it in the back channel for you. It's probably just easier for you to follow if you have that document. So that's one of the resources, and why it's great to come and attend the session live with us, so that as we're talking about things and a resource comes up, you actually get it right away as we're sharing. So let's see. One of the things we're going to do is, how do we know we're providing it? Well, we're going to look for these levels, and we're going to see if, as we move through, or as we share different examples of technology uses in our teaching and learning, can we see evidence that the use of the tech is starting to transform how we teach and how we learn? So to be at the highest level would be where we're finding examples of redefinition, that the technology is going to allow for the creation of new tasks previously inconceivable. So that's really going to push our thinking. And when I give us an example, I'm going to ask you where you think we are in this using this SAMR model. And I like that I gave you the Google Doc, because it gives you the research behind it as well, and who created it. And Allison, I did say I think that a lot of what we're doing is at that augmentation level. And I think, and I'm so happy you're willing to say that that's exactly what this tool is supposed to do, is when we do the self-assessment and we say, I think that's where I am, because it becomes, our comfort level is it became greater efficiency to provide feedback to the student's writing. So then we want to think about, is there any little tweak, and let's help each other, that how we can modify the task so that the tech is going to allow for a significant task redesign. So something we would have given, and now is it going to be redesigned so we can get even more out of it? And more importantly, can it impact the type of learning that our students could do? So the first one we want to tackle is, how do we design reflective assessments using the ePortfolios? And I have a couple samples to share. So we're going to focus on this topic. I'm going to move out of our presentation here, and I'm going to take you to my desktop so that I can share with you some examples. And how do learners create an ePortfolio to measure world-class learning? So when I think of us designing the template for the ePortfolio, and I'm wondering if any of you have designed your own, since several of you have used them with grade levels and or a classroom. Andrea, you said it was with your classroom. I think it was Lynn who used them with grades through 6. Well, I better stop really quickly, because I was going to talk about ePortfolios, but Julie, you asked a great question. You said, are we wanting our assessments to be in the transformational level? What we're using our assessments for is to see if the digital age teaching and learning we're offering is at the transformational level. So I think we want to use, I'm going to use different measurements. SAMR model was to help us to reflect and to think about the types of learning, because, for example, in this ePortfolio, you're going to see students who are sharing their learning. So if this is a Venn diagram, this one being right on the screen, let's use this as our example to get us started with and connect to your question. We would have done this on paper and pencil. So what benefit do we get by doing it digitally? And so in this case, the student has put a reflection underneath, and I'm going to share his full site with you. And you're right that there are a lot of levels that we're going to have a discussion about, but the SAMR part is this student did something with technology, and for us, we want to say at the most what this does is efficiency. And I think it was Allison who said that she feels like she is at that augmentation because it's more efficient, and she's able to look at all her students' work and not have to carry heavy binders at home. She's able to do it digitally in class or out of class. And then it's going to become a discussion about next steps. Are we putting each of the students' ePortfolios in a place where students can access each other? And is there a place below this where the students are giving feedback to their peers? Is there a place they've made it public and they're inviting other learners or other family members or other experts, authors, to see the work of what they're doing in their ePortfolio and to share it? So in some ways, a project that a student might share, and this gets to our thinking about what level is it at. If in the classroom I was able to do paper and pencil and the students would have turned this in for just me, now that I'm using technology and I have an opportunity to offer more authentic audience for my students' work, that's where we're getting that tweak. So if this teacher only allows the teacher and the student to share, it's just more efficient. It's more efficient than using the paper and pencil, but we haven't done a modification that would have been something different. When you and I were in school as students, there was no opportunity for us to have an author take a look at our writing and give us feedback. But we know from Will Richardson, who's one of those ed tech visionaries who talks to us about how he uses blogging with his students. He actually had the author of Life of Bees, and is it Sue Monk Kidd, I think, who wrote that? And she actually went in and blogged about writing and where she gets her ideas and how she does the writing process. and his students were reflecting about how they write. And because they used a public forum, that was something that never would have been conceivable when we went to school. So really good 20th century instruction. When we get the digital tools with it, now we expand our learners and they're able to not only learn from that author, but have really rich dialogue with each other, with the author, and they invited some other classrooms to participate as well. So it really changed their perspective about being an authentic writer. And that's an example of it. So we have this e-portfolio. I'm going to share it. So I hope that answered the question. And we're going to be looking for our assessment. So an e-portfolio becomes a formative assessment. It's this would be one of the pieces of evidence this student has for how he or she, it's a little boy I think, or how these two boys collaborate and how they think about comparing and contrasting a topic. Great learning. Totally would have done this in class face-to-face. So when you're thinking about the rubric, about where it is in the SAMR model, is it at augmentation, or is there a tweak we would recommend to make it a modification? So I hope that was a good example of where we're going. If the students are not collaborating with others, I don't see why this would be different from paper and pencil. Exactly. So it would really be more of a substitution. And that's exactly what we're going to look at when people are creating e-portfolios. It's kind of like, okay, so you created an e-portfolio. Are you opening it up to have more feedback, more authentic feedback from their peers? Are they creating projects that they're collaborating with other students in another country, from another state, from another school? Where do we see opportunities for the learning to be more than what we would have done? All we're doing is digitizing worksheets. If we leave it at fact-based, so these students telling us what they know and understand, and they've done it with some images, but nothing here is getting us to that higher order thinking of analyzing and applying what we know. And I don't know exactly what the topic is on this one. We're going to go out and take a look at this. So I hope that explains it, and I want you to push back on what I'm saying so that I can make sure I explain it clearly. I'm going to stop sharing this, and I'm going to take us out to those examples of e-portfolios and take a look at a few more of these. So one of the questions we had on our slide was, how can we make it reflect world-class education? And one of the samples of a e-portfolio comes from Lone Tree Elementary School in Douglas County. And Kay is the one who designed this e-portfolio, and she's helping her teachers to design learning opportunities for their students so that the type of learning is designed through a knowledge building center. And I know that sounds funny that she would say knowledge, because often we say at the bottom of Bloom's is remembering and understanding. But when we go through the depth of understanding, we come out with a depth of knowledge. And that's what she means by this, is that you actually use all the levels of Bloom's in your unit design to help our students to create a real depth of knowledge. And what I see in here that she's included is opportunities for the teachers to ensure that they have collaboration. How will the students be doing this for real world connections? So she's put it in here the same way that Wiggins also challenged us to design our learning opportunities to get to real world. She's challenging them to have global communication. Again, that idea that if we're going to get to transformation, we're going to have to take this learning beyond the student giving their work to just the teacher? Where are the opportunities for the learners to expand their thinking globally? Are they able to connect with experts? So one of the teachers in our district from Rock Canyon High School just won the Apple Award on Saturday night, and part of what they shared in her video was that Sani was having her high school students who are in the biotech classroom Skype with experts, so other scientists in the real world, and all they did was email those scientists and request like a half-hour conversation with the students. They also took them on a tour of their lab. They talked about how they use like a scientific model, a journal, and the students were amazed that their classroom teacher in Douglas County has them using that same type of a journal to take their notes, and really they're getting a real world experience, or more like Wiggins said, a scenario. What she does in her classroom is create scenarios that are very much like the workforce readiness skills that they're going to need to become those scientists or biotech engineers. So I think that this is actually modeling the world-class education expectations that as we're doing our unit design, here are some of the things that we want to have. And again, there's a space given for reflections. So as we're designing the units and the assignments, take time to reflect about what's working as a teacher and take time to express what you see happening for the learners. So here's another one. This is Thunder Ridge High School created a student portfolio in the fall, and these are some of the types of things they put in there. This is more common that you see for the students, is that they have my work samples on here. Now the hope is that the teacher will also give a time or space for self-reflection, peer reflection, getting authentic feedback, perhaps from the teacher as well. So I'm giving you some different examples. This one has a space for the students to do their goals and their planning. Here's another space, just a space for blogging. And that's really interesting. If it is on this space, a blog usually needs an authentic audience. A blog is a conversation where you're putting in there, reflecting about your learning, but you're going to want to have, just like you're doing in the back channel. When Julie asked me that question about, you know, I'm not quite sure about the type of assessment here and where does SAMR fit, I'm saying that this e-portfolio is a reflective place to learn, and it becomes part of our balanced assessment system. It's one of those formative assessments that we can check in and see how students are doing with their understanding about a topic. So as they're learning about, pick a topic, ecosystems, as they're learning about U.S. history or the Revolutionary War, we give the students a chance to do those kinds of similar connections that we do with text. Can they make some connections to what they're reading, what they're viewing in videos, what they're hearing in their classroom? Can they make those connections to the text? Can they make connections to what's happening in the real world? Where are they going to need to apply? Well, we have an elementary school that's doing robotics with their students, and ensuring that the kids understand, where does that fit with physics? Where does it fit with engineering? Why learn robotics in elementary school? And when the students were asked that, some of them couldn't answer that question. So having a chance to blog and reflect about the meaning of what we're learning, and I like to go back to Allison's point about making connections across content areas. So there's lots of areas for this. And then having a space for the research resources was also important. So that's an example. And then I want to share with you one that comes from, I have a resource on the EdTech site, and I'm going to make sure you have this in the back channel as well. This one gives some resources about starting e-portfolios and thinking about purpose, thinking about a rubric for creating. What would you put in there in your portfolio that are worthy projects? And Andrea, you gave the example that you're participating in the EdTech Academy, and I often get from teachers, but I've done a million things this year. I don't know which one to put. And I say to them, well, this is the same issue that our students have is determining what are the 3 to 5 big highlights of what you've been able to do this year. So we actually need to go through that process of what of my work shows that I am distinguished, that I am proficient, that I'm apprentice. Using a rubric is really helpful. Or you could use, you know, the standards from CITE or our standards for our learners to help guide what you choose. So you want to pick things that say, you know, when I began the year, I could clearly see I was at the apprentice level, but now as I have gone through a different project or I've done this, I'll use the example as an EdTech Academy person of being a coach. You may have started the year and felt unsure about your role, and then as you've done it, you've supported 2 or 3 other teachers, you have evidence of how you've become more proficient and maybe even examples of where you think you're distinguished in your coaching. So I think having that type of a rubric or criteria of what we're putting in for purpose is really important. Let's see. This one is that example where this was shared from Prairie Crossing, and this was the first year that they did it. So she, the tech teacher there is Debbie Blair, and when she first started, she started as a place for collecting different examples. So a piece of writing sample is in here. And we see the students writing, and there are no comments at the bottom, but we're going to see it evolve over time. So as she partnered with the technology and the teacher, this is a different example where students were putting in how they do problem solving. But now notice they're starting to do it where they use the comments at the bottom so that the student can give reflections about what they learned and what this meant to them as to showing about their growth and achievement. So we want to give our students a chance to reflect about how the learning impacts their overall experience in the classroom. This is that one that I took the screenshot of, and we saw it here, and then it says that there's also an attachment and that they had used a Google Earth scavenger hunt so they could learn more about geography. So now we're finding out, remember how we thought if it was just this, it would have been at substitution level, they would have digitized what we would have done as a compare and contrast with a Venn diagram. But now we find out in this learning on the ePortfolio that they were able to create in Google Earth, and that they were able to apply what they were learning in the classroom and use it. It sounds like they learned more about geography and Anchorage, Alaska. So I'm not sure how it connected with the topic up on top, but I can see that they took that lesson, which was exactly what we were wondering. Here's the link to their Google Earth tour. Now we're going to see them apply. So at least we can see the level of thinking and the rigor in this type of assignment, and that's exactly what a teacher is going to be looking for. Did they stay at the lower level artifacts, or are they able to move on and reflect about their learning at a higher level? So I hope those were a couple good examples. I'm going to come back to our group and see your back channel about the ePortfolios. So looking at these, let's see, is there a rubric? Let me come back and see what your back channel is. Hang on one second. Okay, so Julie has a question. Is there a rubric, or how is learning measured for all students? Is there, we definitely want to make rubrics for the quality of our ePortfolios, and in the EdTech Academy, everyone is creating an EdTech site that collects all the evidence, and I provided a rubric for how we could look at what types of evidence are we putting in, and if we're putting in evidence that, I don't actually remember the whole rubric. I can go show it to you afterwards, but yes, I think you need a rubric on your ePortfolio so that when we go to, remember when we looked at the Lone Tree Elementary one, and the tabs she put up there were expectations that would get you to global communication. So she didn't just say, I want examples of you communicating. Basically, she was doing some of the 4 C's, communication and collaboration. She was also defining it on the page in that template that we need examples of global communication, and I would think they're going to do more than letter writing, and it assumes that there's a use of technology to support that global communication. So I think the way she built her template actually redefined it, and not just putting in this type of evidence of show me that you did work. It was more about the thinking and how you were, the learning, and that we use the tools to help us. Could we use one of the 4C rubric? Absolutely, Andrea. I think that's a great example. And why not build the template with the rubric in it so that students can always go back and see how well are they meeting or exceeding the expectations. So I think even putting in the students, wouldn't it be interesting if they were putting in the learning outcomes at the top of this? So what exactly was this about? What were they learning? Was this about collaboration and 2 students getting to know each other, which is what I think it is. It's about, that was probably done at the beginning of the year, and then later they did the one on the geography and using Google Earth. So I definitely think we should be using it. Let me just read a couple more comments so I can get in here with all of you. My colleagues have students write book reviews on Amazon, Goodreads, and Barnes & Noble. This has been great in getting kids to be more thoughtful in their writing. So it sounds to me like they're contributing to online blogs, Allison, and that puts them in a larger community, and they're seeing themselves as having a voice about the type of books that they read and what others are reading. That's a great example. If that's true, that's something inconceivable from what we would have done previously, and it takes our book reviews that we've done in classes and bumps it up to a wider audience. So I think if not augmentation, I think it gets to modification. It redesigns the task. And I'm going to admit to you, when we go and do research from that SAMR model, I haven't seen what they give us as examples of what's been inconceivable. So my best way of filtering it, the way I understand it, is to compare it to really good 20th century instruction, which we all experience. And as teachers, anyone who's been teaching, you know, the last 10, 20 years, some of us, I think, have been around that long in education. What are we seeing that's transforming it? So we're going to keep looking for those ideas. Okay, so we've got our e-portfolios. We've got different ways that we can create those with our learners. How do we design reflective assessments that, and we're going to look at social learning networks. So how many of you have used something like an Edmodo, have used a blog? And then as you're reflecting about using those social learning networks for your students, have you provided a rubric for what's an acceptable level of participation? So this is that UW-Madison white paper about authenticity of instruction, and it gives us this rubric. So these are some of the things that they're recommending we look for in the online and actually in face-to-face authenticity of our instruction. So it fits for both. So we're looking for the level of thinking the students are doing. Are they doing just lower level thinking, facts? This is facts about the geography. We'll use the example the boys had just shared in their e-portfolio. Or is there a way they're getting to the higher level of thinking and they're looking at relationships between countries? They're looking at how our cultures are alike and different, and how that impacts politics, how it impacts economies, how it impacts culturally our decision making. Often we hear in medicine the difference between Western thinking and Eastern thinking. So are we getting to that level of thinking in our responses? Are we showing our depth of knowledge that we also saw from Kay? Lone Tree Elementary's e-portfolio. So having an assessment, this might be one you want to use. And again, Kay put this into hers. She gave us that one that I think tied more closely to world-class education and learning. Is there an expectation of connectedness to the world beyond the classroom? So are the learning activities, so if we use the Prairie Crossing one, at the beginning of the year, they were using their Venn diagram to do compare and contrast, and we think of that gradual release in learning. We saw that example at the beginning of the year, but then we saw throughout the year that they were doing the Google Earth tours, and they were sharing those, and that can be a collaborative space. So it is a place where they're connecting their learning beyond just what they have in a textbook. So there's another example. Now this is a big one, and this is where we would get really having our rubric in our blogs, in our Edmodos, in our back channel, like right now tonight. If we were going to look for substantive conversation, in the white paper it defines it this way. Is the conversation going back and forth authentically? So for example, if I asked a question, are your comments connecting to what I've asked? So I asked you about social learning networks. And if you ask a question, is your question authentic to the conversation, to deepen it, to clarify? So Julie, you actually gave us a question that was clarifying about the types of assessments and how we're going to use those. That actually gets us to a more substantive conversation. And as Julie asks it, as I respond, did anyone else join in on that idea of what is this role of reflections in our assessment, and how does it show us the different levels? Is it starting to move us towards transformative, towards learning that's beyond the low-level thinking? So we're looking for all of these things. We're looking for the higher order thinking. We're looking for a depth of knowledge. We're looking to connectedness to the world beyond our classroom. And we're looking for substantive conversation. So this one is huge. Actually, I tried it at the dinner table with my family and said, you know, when you ask your family, oh, what was your day like? And they all say fine or good, or I had a test today. What I was noticing is that we were just at a surface level of our dinner conversation, and we started to talk about what makes it a richer conversation and how it has to flow back and forth. So another good example of this is doing the fishbowl in the center of the classroom, and then the outer circle is doing a blog and connecting to it. And you could use this as a rubric for your the depth of conversation, is what people are contributing in the back channel, what they're contributing in the inner circle of the fishbowl. Is it at a higher order thinking? Is it showing a depth of knowledge? Are they connecting it beyond just to their own experience? Are they connecting it to textbooks? Are they connecting it to real world experiences? So Andrea says she's been using Show Me in Class, and it's a social learning network. I thought Show Me was the one where they make the little videos, Andrea, and then they contribute it to a social networking place. So I thought of it along the lines of like Khan Academy, where the students would explain maybe how they solve problems or how they understand what a healthy ecosystem is. So they would explain it, draw it. They could show that, you know, the healthy ecosystem requires the sun and the earth, and we know it's healthy because, and they could diagram it and record their understanding, and then the video gets put into a social network. And I think you can reply to them as well. A lot like Pinterest too. Okay, so let's take a look at some examples. So I'm going to take you out here and keep having your back channel because we want to have a substantive conversation and show our depth of knowledge about different assessments. Let's see, so we did I'm going to close some tabs out so I don't get myself confused here. I know this was all about ePortfolio, so we're good with that. And Edmodo is the one I wanted to share with you. So in Edmodo, when we pose our questions, this is really the place I need to to challenge all of us is that we as the educators, and or if we can build it in our students as well, to ask those large, big, open-ended questions. And then I think it's important to teach an etiquette in a post. So if I ask, how did what you learned today enhance your understanding of a world-class education? So this is the group I'm in right now is for the BRTs, and we met today and had a great learning day. So if I post this as a big open-ended question, one of the things I think is really helpful is if you can teach the participants to reply to that question so that you can keep the responses all together. Let me see if I can find one that we did that with. So let's see. This was, I'm just trying to find a good, we had a couple threaded conversations where you can see all the responses. The problem I have with this wall is that you have to scroll down to find all the different responses, and it's kind of hard to follow it. So I will use Edmodo as a collection of getting all the voices in the room to be heard, and to archive some of the different places that we went in a day of learning. But I wonder, it would be very hard to assess it in here because it's hard to find it. Versus if I use a back channel like a Cover It Live, and if I keep the whole conversation about ecosystems in one threaded conversation, that one seems to work a little better. And I need to share with you an example of a Cover It Live. In the back channel, have any of you used that tool as well? I'm trying to think if I can find one for us. But there is a difference to using a back channel that keeps everything all together than using one that's a long page of it and being able to go back in and seeing it. So we want to be able to give our students authentic feedback about the type of responses they're doing. And let me just log in here real fast. We'll get this one. So you get to see another tool in here as well. Okay, so I have some completed events, and I think I'd be able to come in and take a look at them. Let's see, this one has a lot of entries, so in here you can see that it's going to keep everything together. We had a 1-hour discussion about technology in education, and that keeps everything from that conversation all together, including my formative polls. So now I get a sense of overall how's my class doing, and using a poll is really helpful to get a sense of do I need to go back and cover something. You know, in this case we were asking about their comfort with standards in technology, and when you see that 61% are just somewhat comfortable, and 32%, you've got the majority of people feeling not sure about the content. So you're going to need to adjust your teaching to go through those slowly and more in depth. So using a poll in the learning is really helpful. So when I think about the levels of SAMR, and I'm asking all of you in the back channel, having digital tools like this that include a poll, where were we getting that kind of instant data where we could put up polls to check for understanding? Where were we ever doing that before the use of technology? We might have had kids do a show of hands, do a fist of 5, but there's something about an anonymous poll that gives you people are more likely to be honest about it because they're not being judged. And they get to watch how the teacher uses that information and changes the instruction based on that. So I think that's really helpful as well. I see we're about to run out of time, so I haven't gotten through all of our things. This one was for social media. And I know my next one, let me see. The one I wanted to share with you next is, let's see, this one. All right, so using Google Forms for reflections. And so this one ties to visible thinking routines. So we want to have, oh, my link isn't working here, so I'm going to go and grab visible thinking routines. I promised to be done in 5 minutes, so I'll catch you up on the last two that I wanted to share with you. So this one is using visible thinking routines from Harvard, and we take these core routines. So we're always looking for those big open-ended questions, and maybe we're starting a topic about, is there really global warming? And you have this big open-ended, and even though I ask it as yes or no, that type of question begs a discussion and depth of knowledge and a conversation about it. So one of the places we might do something like this is, now I just did lose, so I went to here, let me grab my path again. So visible thinking routines, and I'll fix that link for us on Andrea's site. Okay. So a place that we can use those, it's in Google Forms. So let's take an example where we have our students and we're using a Google form, but we want it to be reflections. We want them to be reflecting about literacy. I'm going to give you an example in numeracy as well. So you create the form, and this one has text-to-self connections, text-to-world connections, and text-to-text connections. And when we come back into see the responses, we can share the responses with the students, and we actually can have students go inside the form and give feedback to each other. So I wanted you to see that we can use visible thinking routines, and we can put them in with our Google Forms, and we can start to see the depth of understanding our students. And one teacher said, so if this was the example of having writing journals, and now we go and we put once a week or once a month, we do it digitally, why? And one teacher said that she had 5th grade boys that were very unmotivated to do their reading journals and reflect about their text. But when they did it digitally and they could see each other's responses, now notice there are no names. The teacher can hide the names, so you can hide that column up here, who responded. You just hide it, and now it's non-judgmental. It's just some of the responses we're seeing in our class. And now we can say, get that rubric out about how well are we doing in our depth of knowledge, how well are we doing in higher order thinking about our books, and then what would we recommend to our classmates. And one teacher said that she would show the responses, and she would say the one rule is you cannot have the same response as someone else. So some of the boys in the class in particular said they started going home and doing their homework right away, filling out that form, because they knew you'd have to do deeper thinking if you didn't get in there right away and get the easy answers. So that was kind of an interesting one. This is an example where a teacher took an article, put it into the Google form, and it could be an article about anything, global warming, about water preservation or water safety. And then we used a visible thinking down here called compass points. What excites you about the idea of what you're learning about water conservation? If we do these things now, will our future generations, have better, cleaner water? It's going to help our ecosystem for our animals. So the students read the article and then they reflect down here what excites them about that, what's worrisome about the article, what do they find, the ideas, what worries them, what's the downside in it, what do they need to know more about, and what's their stance for moving forward? Do they need more research? How are they going to do that? So those give you some examples of using visible thinking routines, big questions, and then using the Google Forms to share the responses. And so if you decide to, a lot of teachers said that it was just a surprise to think about sharing the back end of the form as well. This is an example where a teacher did math problems. She said you have 10 math problems, but you're only going to put your answers in for 3 of them. So you're going to come in, you're going to put your name in here, you're going to pick your answers, and in this case, this is a lot like formative assessment with clickers, but we're using just a Google form, And this last one's your open-ended question. What was the learning target or the learning outcome for tonight or your assignment, and explain how you solved the practice problems. So we're getting to a deeper level of thinking. So we want to check for deeper thinking here. And a lot of those clicker sets for $1,000 per classroom, you're not able to ask open-ended questions. So now as the teacher comes in, they're able to come and right away in the morning, they can see how well did our students do. And in a Google form, you can see responses. And when you give them the choices, now we know we can't move forward. A third of our class thinks it's 7 remainder of 2. Over half our class thinks it's 5 remainder of 5. And 14% think it's the last one. We need to go back and talk to each other and figure out how we solve those math problems and decide what is the right answer. So this gives a teacher a fast snapshot for where to go with their teaching in math, or any type of, this would be more of the right-wrong answers, but it really is going to drive instruction. So again, when we think about the levels of CMR, this might just be augmentation, and it just makes grading faster. It makes doing more differentiated instruction the next day much better. And then you also can share the types of responses here, and the kids could have the rubrics. You could hide all the other answers and just have them self-assess or assess the group on that one. All right, team, I know my time is up with you, and that gave you a few more examples. Let me come back and share my desktop with you. I need to really reflect to think about how to apply this to primary. So is it kindergarten, first, second grade? I think if you went away with ensuring that we're asking our students big open-ended questions, that we're asking them to do higher order thinking, comparing and contrasting, and applying what they learn. The very last one that I didn't share with you in a Google Doc, but is this idea of putting in an article and using the insert comments on the side. So it most mirrors what you're doing on the back channel. But what I recommend with Google Docs is not putting more than 3 to 5 students inside the doc so that they can read and they can insert their comments, and they can have, and again, if we're assessing it with that rubric from UW-Madison, we're looking for a substantive conversation on the side. We're looking for depth of knowledge. We're looking for higher order thinking. We're looking for the questions and the conversation to go back and forth. So on the little chat on the side of a Google Doc, when you insert your comments, Dawn can respond to Renee, and you can have it threaded back and forth just like you're doing in the back channel. So I hope these were helpful, and it is 2 minutes after, so I'm just checking if you have any questions. I'll definitely spend a little bit of extra time in here. But to review, what we wanted out of this was to think about how those types of reflective assessments can be used formatively, that it helps a teacher to know where his or her learners are, that it helps us to differentiate our instruction. And let's see. One of the questions, do all the kids need to have a computer or a smartphone or iPad? One of the things we did today with this type of learning is we did it in small groups, and we discussed, and we had one person be the recorder. So if you have a classroom of 30 students and you have them sitting in groups of 4, that gets you're going to need about 5 computers or 5 devices in the classroom, 5 iPads, something so that you can have table discussions. And again, it just goes in that piece of how collaboration helps us to deepen our own understandings, our own thinking, but how we can learn from others as well. So let's see. Lynn's excited to try the Google Doc. And to implement a poll, if you do the poll, like for example, in this group, and if you're welcome to stay. I'm going to just do a couple extras here for you. Let's see. This one, I think you're able to see me. Let's see. I'll do a quick poll. All right. So a poll can be as fast as, was this helpful? This is a formative assessment. It's going to help drive my instruction. And then what I would ask is, in the back channel, you explain your answer. So what about this was helpful? And if it wasn't helpful, what about it did not help meet your learning needs? So that's the example of using a poll very quickly. You can put polls into Edmodo. You can put polls into Cover It Live. And we also talked about using a Google form as a poll as well to get a sense of, well, I shared with you a couple of those where you can have yes, no answers like we did with the math problems, but you can also ask the open-ended questions to explain their thinking about how they solved the problems. So you can vote. It's just fun. It was just a quick when she asked me that. All right, so I'm going to say thank you.